makers and market movers. This is The Pulse with Francine Lacqua.
Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to The Pulse. I'm Francine Lacqua here in London with the conversations that matter, and here's what's coming up on today's program. The Israeli military begins moving civilians out of Rafah, a possible prelude to a long-expected attack on the city in Gaza. Xi Jinping begins a three-nation European tour in Paris as French President Emmanuel Macron seeks to reset ties with Beijing. Plus, softer than expected U.S. jobs data revives bets that the Fed will cut rates this year. So good morning, everyone. A lot going on in these markets. Let's take a look at the European markets map. Of course, for a lot of UK traders and also people in the UK in general, it's a bank holiday, so ignore that. The FTSE for the moment is closed. But stocks in general, in Europe, but also we saw that in Asia, stocks extending some of the gains that we saw last week. Again, traders focusing on the prospect of a Federal Reserve to actually cut interest rates. Now, I don't know whether there's going to be more calm on the economic front. I guess we have a few economic releases and limited central bank interventions. There's the Bank of England on Thursday, but it seems that a lot of the focus will be exactly on what's happening with geopolitics, especially in Israel. Now, if you look at the S&P 500 futures in the U.S., pretty much unchanged, and then euro-dollar 107.60. So, to politics and geopolitics, and Israel's military has begun moving civilians out of Rafah in a possible prelude to a long-expected attack on the Gazan city. Now, the Israel Defense Forces released a statement saying they will act, quote, with extreme force against terrorist organizations in your areas of residence. This is a spokesman that was actually posting on X. Now let's get more on this story with Sylvia Westall, Bloomberg's managing editor for economy and government in Dubai. And we're also joined by Rosalind Matheson, Bloomberg's news director in the EMEA region. So thank you both for joining us. Sylvia, I mean, this is a huge development, and this comes after many countries around the world urged Israel not to go into Rafah.
That's right, and I think the big question is what the reaction will be to any attack on it. I think, it's clear that the timing is unclear. It's not clear if there'll be any military movement into Rafah anytime soon, if that will happen in a kind of big wave or in targeted attacks. But just the idea that this could be happening soon, because the first step was expected to be the movement of civilians out of the city. This has started all the questions about what will happen next. The reason why it's important is that obviously there's about 1 million civilians sheltering there. It's become a big issue between Israel and its allies, the US, and around the world. The region is watching, and there's the possibility that there could be an escalation in cross-border attacks from Hezbollah in Lebanon or other Iran-backed proxy groups in the region, like the Houthis in the Red Sea, in reaction to this. And we've also seen, what this could have in terms of the ceasefire talks as well.
So, Ros, there are more than 1 million people in the city, right? And a lot of them actually fled after the outbreak of the Israel-Hamas war in October. The Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, has said that he would always give civilians a warning. I mean, does it mean that we're quite close, or will this take time?
Well, Sylvia was just saying, we're sort of at the beginning here, because what we know is they're dropping leaflets. They're telling people in one part of Rafah to essentially move to another part, so they're not trying to move them that far. But there are still, that's maybe 100,000 people, but Sylvia was saying there's 1 million, at least, that we know in that area. So this could be something that takes quite a bit of time to relocate people en masse out of what they would consider to be the danger zone for any offensive. So, this could take days. It could even potentially take weeks. We know from their rhetoric they see this as urgent. They say they want to go into Rafah sooner rather than later. But still, they need to walk that line, especially, again, with their allies, the US and others, who've been saying for weeks and weeks, be careful if you're going to go ahead with this. And even Benjamin Netanyahu can't risk mass casualties out of this offensive into Rafah. So it's very unclear. Israel's not put a time frame on it, and that's deliberate. But it could take some days, if not weeks, to move people out of harm's way.
Yeah, and as Roz was saying, Sylvia, most Arab and many European states have said that Israel should not attack Rafah because of the possible civilian casualties. What do we know about a possible ceasefire?
Yeah, it's a good point. That's a main point that's been raised all the way through. This idea, I think the US perhaps has a slightly more nuanced approach in that it's told Israel to do everything it can to protect civilians if it decides to go in, but it hasn't said that Israel cannot go in. In terms of the ceasefire talks, we've just sort of headlined a report from Mayadeen, a local channel in the Middle East, saying that Hamas has said it will withdraw from ceasefire talks based on what is happening on the ground. So already those talks look quite fraught. It had looked like they were nearing towards some kind of possible conclusion, and now it's this real balance. So there's also the question about whether Israel's decision to start moving people out and saying that it will go into Rafah is also a pressure tactic. Both sides are trying to pressure each other into coming to some kind of conclusion. Israel says it needs to go into Rafah because there are several thousand Hamas fighters still there, and that in order to finish the war, it needs to eliminate them. But this is very difficult because of the amount of civilians that are sheltering there and the difficulties of moving people around a war zone.
Yeah, and Ross, this is exactly to Sylvia's point, like where do the residents actually go? So we know that the army instructed people not to go towards the border fence with Israel or Egypt, and it's unclear. I mean, Egypt has said they won't take that many people in.
Well, that's right. In essence, you really need to move north, and they've been cautious about that too, about letting people back out of the southern part of Gaza to relocate north. And that's been part of the conversations also around a ceasefire. Do you allow the movement of people to go north? Do you stop them being inspected on the way? What are they going back to? Because certainly they can't go south. You just run out of places to go. And then you've got people even more bunched up on that border area trying to get through Egypt. As you said, we don't want them to come through. So then you've got really a dangerous moment for a lot of people clustered in a small area. So it is limited where they can go. And then if they relocate north or even outside Rafah itself, what's left for them there? Houses have been destroyed. There's no infrastructure in terms of schools or hospitals or food. So are you sending people back to an area where they're not going to be able to take care of themselves?
I mean, are there any back channels? Do we know if the President Biden is on the phone with Benjamin Netanyahu? We know that the two have frosty relationships. Is Qatar involved? What would be happening today?
Well, we know that the US and Israel are talking constantly, and there are those frequent phone calls between Joe Biden and Benjamin Netanyahu. That's front-facing. Behind the scenes, there's a lot going on. We know that William Burns is in Israel today, for example, to continue talks. So there's a lot of shuttle diplomacy going on. Antony Blinken seems to be there constantly as well. The question is, what does that all achieve? What does all that US pressure achieve? In the end, the US has said Israel remains our key military and strategic ally. We'll continue to, supply them with weapons. We want them to be careful, but they're not going to turn their backs on Israel, and Israel knows that.
Thank you both for joining us. Of course, that was Ross Matheson and Sylvia Westall, Managing Editor for Economy and Government, and of course, head of our news desk here in London. Now, coming up, softer than expected U.S. jobs data revives bets that the Fed will cut rates this year. We'll have all of the markets wrap next. This is Bloomberg. Well, U.S. employers scaled back hiring in April, and the unemployment rate unexpectedly rose. The data suggests some cooling is underway in the labor market after a strong start to the year. Now, for more on all of this, we're joined by Laureline Chatelain, the fixed income strategist at Banque Pictet, and Bloomberg's executive editor for Asia markets, Paul Dobson. So thank you both for joining us. Paul, let's start off with you. We had a big earnings season, and now this week, I know a little bit thin volumes because of a holiday in Japan and here in the UK, but actually it seems that all focus back on the Fed and how much they will cut by.
Yeah, and the market is pretty excited about what it learned last week as well. First of all, from the comments from Powell after the Fed meeting, which played down the possibility of any hike this year and had the market thinking that, OK, we're definitely going to see some cuts at some point once again. And then that soft jobs data, both on the hourly earnings side and on the headline number, gave the market increased confidence again in that kind of softer landing scenario. So we've seen bond yields fall and equities seem to have taken some solace from that as well with the rally into the end of the week. Asia markets, where they were traded today, picked up the baton. From that, we had lower bond yields. We had softer dollar on the whole, and equity markets also benefiting and getting an extra tailwind here from the gains in China as well, which has taken on a little bit of its own momentum in recent days and weeks too.
Laureline, what's your take on, first of all, are we going to have a lot of volatility with Fed expectations with any real data point? And what does that mean for Treasuries?
Good morning. Thank you for having me. So yes, indeed, we expect a bit more volatility ahead. However, what was key from Powell's speech last week was the asymmetry in terms of not very likely that they're going to hike this year. So it probably puts a cap on long-term Treasury yields. Now we'll watch, of course, what happened with the US election. That could build a bit of term premium, but so far we would really expect Treasury yields to hover around 4.5 or maybe head lower if we have more confirming data that inflation is softening in the US.
So, Laureline, what's your highest conviction market view right now?
So really now our big theme is from cash to duration. So we really see the rise in long-term yields we've seen in the recent months as a good entry point to really lock in these elevated yields. So we're really trying to buy longer dated bonds, both on credit but also on sovereign. And we have recently moved overweight on gilts, actually.
And Paul, I mean, a lot of the focus, of course, has been on yen. We heard from Janet Yellen and kind of what she was saying that, you know, she has no reason. I can't remember her exact words, but she said, look, it's not a given that certainly the Bank of Japan intervened, or they should have maybe given them a warning. But Paul, what's your take on the week ahead? We have a little bit less data, and so a little bit maybe less things to surprise the markets.
Hoping for a little bit more calm and quiet, that's right. And we saw measures of implied volatility coming off at the back end of last week as well. I think on the yen, you know, Yellen's comments weren't too strong, but she did give that impression that, you know, intervention in currency markets shouldn't be a regular occurrence, should be a kind of, you know, something that's safe for extremes. But I think that the fact that Japan's finance minister and the South Korean counterpart were in Washington not recently and talking about it with Yellen, and she gave some support to their arguments talking about the weakness of their currencies, that was already kind of greenish light from the US at that point to intervene if they saw the need. Now, we don't know for certain that that's what happened, but we have some pretty strong evidence pointing in that direction. I think that, you know, Yellen won't mind that too much. A little bit more of a soft dollar is probably helpful for the US as well. But she won't want us to get into that situation where we're constantly seeing FX intervention coming from various different forces, because that causes more market instability, market uncertainty, and also starts to, you know, skew the real signals that the market is trying to give as well. So I think a much better and more sustainable solution would be if we could get to a point where, yes, the Fed could start studying, and yes, the Bank of Japan could continue to raise interest rates and narrow that gap a little bit, so taking some of the pressure off the yen that way.
Yeah, and to Laureline's good point also, I know you were talking about, you know, from cash to duration. Laureline, where do you see, are there regions that look more attractive at the moment, or you do look at it differently?
So yes, as I was mentioning, we've moved recently overweight on gilts. Our expectation there is that the Bank of England is likely to start its rate cutting cycle in June, and we see that the market pricing is a bit on the downside compared to our expectation of 4 rate cuts. The market sees a bit more than 2. So we would expect already there yields falling with a more dovish BOE than what the market has in mind, and also the fact that inflation expectations are still very elevated in the UK, and we have more and more evidence that we could see inflation softening and going into the 2% direction that the BOE has in mind.
Laureline, given we had quite a lot of earnings, what's your take on corporate bonds? And again, is there a play right now after earnings?
So the earnings season comforted us with the fact that we still very much like investment grade credit. So we are overweight both in US and Europe on that end. And definitely what we see is that spread are tight, but that's basically okay given the earnings season we have had. But we really need growth to stay comfortable, I would say, because as we know, in a recession, we could see spread widening. So we're very much looking at growth data and earnings season as well.
Thank you, Laureline. Paul, we also seem to be really, the ECB actually got this right in terms of telegraphing that there is probably a cut in June. And then we heard from Philip Lane this morning speaking to some of the local newspapers, or El Confidencial actually in Spain, saying that he's also confident that the trend for inflation is going downwards.
And that's the big bet, and I guess that's what Laureline is also seeing when she's talking about favouring long duration trades. I think It makes a fair deal of sense, particularly if you look at the performance of the market so far this year, where you've seen 1 to 3 year government bonds, at least, with a tiny positive return. But you look at the back end, the 25 years plus, steep losses, minus 5% or more, even with the recovery that we saw at the back end of last week. So that shows you just from the start of this year, there's plenty of ground already for bonds to make up. And if we do start to see that inflationary pressure ebb, if we start to see a little bit of a let up in commodities markets as well, and we see signs that the central banks are going to be able to ease without inflation kind of escaping and slipping back out again of the bottle when they feel that they've got it under control, then that should all bode well for those longer dated bonds, particularly on the corporate side where you can get that yield pickup as well. So across Europe, if you're looking in the UK or in the US, that, you know, kind of like seems to be where there's that opportunity if all of those other things hold in place.
And Laureline, going back to actually what we're expecting a little bit later in the week, we have big auctions in the U.S. I think it's a total of $67 billion of auctions, 10 or 30-year Treasury securities. I mean, do you think those longer dated, I guess, debt will really test demand because some investors won't want part of it?
So I would say what was important from the Treasury announcement we had last week was their commitment not to increase the size of the auction on the nominal coupon. And so I would say that for the several quarters ahead, so I would say that the risk of surprise in terms of auction on the market, as we had last autumn, is very low. And so the market knows that these auctions are coming, but as I was mentioning, yields level are quite attractive, 4.5 on the 10-year Treasury. And I would say that with the good unemployment report we have had on Friday, probably we'll meet the demand there.
Wonderful. Thank you both for joining us. So Laureline Chatelain, they're a fixed income strategist at Banque Pictet, and Bloomberg's very own Paul Dobson. Now, coming up, heading for $200 billion, Berkshire Hathaway's cash pile hits a record high. The highlights from the annual meeting of Warren Buffett's conglomerate next, and this is Bloomberg. Warren Buffett has praised Apple even after revealing he's cut his stake in the tech giant. Now, Buffett actually disclosed the move during Berkshire Hathaway's annual meeting in Omaha, the first since the death of a longtime colleague, Charlie Munger.
We will have Apple as our largest investment, but I don't mind at all, under current conditions, building the cash position. I think when I look at the alternative of what's available in the equity markets, and I look at the composition of what's going on in the world, we find it quite attractive.
Now, for more, let's bring in Bloomberg's Manuel Baigorri. Manuel, so good to have you on TV. So why is Buffett such a strong believer in Apple?
Hello, Francine. My pleasure to be on the show, as always. Thank you. A strong believer in Apple, despite all the headwinds and the challenges the company is facing, from slump in sales here in China to the $2 billion antitrust fine, among others. I mean, he's a strong believer because Apple has come up, as he said, with devices like the iPhone that are arguably some of the best innovations in history, and the company is still doing really well and growing globally. So he's a strong believer. I mean, he's sold down his stake quite significantly in the last quarter, a little bit longer than that. He's reduced his position by like a whopping $40 billion, but still is the largest investment by Warren Buffett, as we just heard from him, and it will remain to be the largest for a while. He was talking about how, despite other great businesses like Coca-Cola, for instance, or American Express, he still believes Apple, it's a great investment, particularly even more so when he looks at what the other alternatives are.
So, of course, why is Buffett continuing to hoard so much cash, Manuel?
I mean, it's a huge amount of cash, right? It's just kind of roughly speaking, $190 billion is fast approaching the 200 billion mark. Perhaps by the end of the year, it will reach past that point, as Warren Buffett said over the weekend in Omaha. And the reality is the stock market globally is still, very volatile, and there is a lot of uncertainties, including interest rates. No one seems to know exactly whether or not there might be a cut in rates later in the year, along with inflation remaining very high and geopolitics globally. So with those factors into account, Warren Buffett seems to be quite confident and quite comfortable hoarding all that cash for now.
Thank you so much, Manuel. Manuel Boygorian, of course, we also have to talk about succession since Warren Buffett is 94. Coming up, China's President Xi is in Europe for the first time in 5 years. So what will this diplomatic trip do for geopolitical issues? That's next, and this is Bloomberg. Well, the Israeli military begins moving civilians out of Rafah, a possible prelude to a long-expected attack on the city in Gaza. Xi Jinping begins a three-nation European tour in Paris as French President Emmanuel Macron seeks to reset ties with Beijing. Plus, softer-than-expected U.S. jobs data revives bets that the Fed will cut rates this year. Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to The Pulse. I'm Francine Lacqua here in London. The Chinese President Xi Jinping is in Paris as he kicks off a three-nation trip to Europe. Now, his first visit to the region in 5 years is really aimed at stabilizing ties in the face of mounting trade tensions. Now, for more on all of this, let's go to Caroline Connat in Paris. Rebecca Thune-Wilkins is also for us in Hong Kong. So, Caroline, good morning. What does the French president actually hope to achieve during this visit?
Francine, you've got, of course, the political symbol, but also the personal touch. So Macron today is going to have a state dinner with President Xi at the Élysée Palace. There's going to be a trilateral meeting with Ursula von der Leyen in just half an hour from now. That's where you'll have all the discussions about the trade tensions between the EU and China. As you know, the EU has launched a series of probes into subsidies for Chinese EV makers, into procurements for medical devices. So that's, of course, going to be a key discussion between Emmanuel Macron and President Xi. But then you have the personal touch. 1 year ago, Macron was in China himself, and President Xi actually took him to the southern province of Guangdong, where he had the ceremony of tea in a region where Xi's father used to be a governor. So that's going to be the personal part of the trip. Macron will take Xi to the Pyrenees Mountains in the southwest of France, where he spent time as a child. Finally, of course, Macron is hoping to get some trade deals announced, possibly with Airbus and some Chinese airlines, and he's also looking for some investments from China into France, possibly in the EV battery sector. Of course, there is also the international debate with the war in Ukraine. Macron has been trying to use Beijing's influence over Vladimir Putin to possibly weigh in on the war in Ukraine without much success so far.
Yeah, so interesting. So that's from the French side. Rebecca, what is Xi looking to get out of this trip?
Well, I think from Beijing's point of view, the big issue is just how close the European Union has come when it comes to the US and this sort of litany of probes launched against state subsidies from Chinese firms. And that has been a huge sticking point from Beijing. Really, the EU walking lockstep with the US on many of these critical issues that has made Beijing deeply unsettled. We also also see Beijing, unlike with US officials though, feeling as if they can engage more deeply and more thoroughly on lots of these topics. So during German Chancellor Olaf Scholz's visit to Beijing, we saw some very forthright and concrete detailed engagement from Premier Li Qiang, as well as President Xi Jinping himself, engaging on these issues of overcapacity, pushing back against some of those criticisms. So from Beijing's point of view and from Xi's point of view, the Europeans are still sort of characters that can be negotiated with and that can have sort of forthright discussions with. And as Caroline points out, for Xi Jinping himself, Macron is someone where he feels like there may be more room to have a more personal relationship here because of that sort of reciprocal visit to Guangdong. Now we are seeing this visit to the Pyrenees, for example. It's hard to imagine many other European leaders offering to take President Xi and his delegation to the site of their grandmother's home. And then the latter part of the trip, when Xi goes to Serbia and Hungary, that will be a slightly different emphasis here. These are two nations that, like China itself, have very close ties to Russia and have this distrust of NATO and other US-led institutions. So this is also a reaffirmation of those close links to Putin. And we know that the Russian president will be visiting Beijing shortly after President Xi returns from Europe. So very much a balancing act. On the one hand, talking and negotiating with this leading European nation in France, trying to move the needle, or at least slow momentum there when it comes to this sort of flurry of probes. On the other hand, reaffirming some of these other relationships, reaffirming those close ties to Russia, as well as showcasing some of the economic advantages to engaging with China. We have potential deals in the offering when it comes to Hungary around automakers. We already know that BYD are planning to open a factory there. And so very much that's China's opportunity to show that the risks that the rewards outweigh the risks when it comes to these types of economic projects.
Thank you both, of course, from the China side and from the French side, Caroline Conant in Paris and Rebecca Chun-Wilkins in Hong Kong. Now, joining us now to talk more about this, Elvire Fabry, Senior Research Fellow at the Jacques Delors Institute. Elvire, thank you so much for joining us. A lot of the focus, of course, is on what the French president has said, which is try to reset ties with China. How will that be taken by France's U.S. allies?
Well, President Macron, since the beginning, for many years, has been advocating for strategic autonomy, and it's something that has pleased Beijing. And beyond the celebration of the diplomatic relations between France and China, President Xi knows that he has a very strategic dialogue with Macron, which could influence the whole position of the EU. Now that the EU is equipped with those new tools of autonomous trade defense tools that were mentioned, and has started to use them, and is signaling that it wants to be much more defensive, but as well offensive with the use of those tools, because the purpose of those tools is to defend the market, but is also to open more, to gain more reciprocity with China. So everything that can keep some distance between the EU and the US is good for China, which is a sort of leverage that Macron wants to use.
But Elvire, I mean, this is very difficult, right? And as you say, Macron wants to distance himself from some of the key investigations that the EU is launching into Chinese EVs, for example. So he's on a charm offensive. But frankly, we've heard from the European Union about excessive subsidies, accusation of spying, and state-sponsored cyber attacks from China. So how difficult is it from the Chinese front to make a difference between, okay, EU, Brussels, and then France and the president?
France and the EU are quite aligned. As I was just saying, President Macron has been a key actor in the adoption of those instruments. So it's once again the fact that von der Leyen is coming to the meeting, as it was the case last year during Macron's visit in Beijing, means that. For the moment, we can expect some very close coordination between the two positions. that is something that it may not be completely the case between France and Germany, and that was the purpose also of the private dinner between Chancellor Scholz and Emmanuel Macron. And we will know quite soon in the coming weeks what will be the result of the investigation on the EVs and what will be how high the tariffs will be imposed on Chinese EVs. But I would expect at least that between France and the common European position in Brussels, there's quite some alignment. But what we have to keep in mind is that Macron has been calling for more protection at the European side. So he may be even trying to push harder on the side of protection with the European preference in public procurement. And so that is something that we have to keep in mind during the next month.
But so, Elvire, I mean, it's a very tough act that he's trying to do, right? So economically, he's saying, look, China, there's a tough stance, I guess, on some of the economic issues that the EU has with China, whilst at the same time keeping them kind of in the global dialogue. Is that what he's trying to do? It's charm to make sure that there are ties for the future, whilst being hard on them now.
I don't know if it's really a charm offensive. I think he's trying to keep Xi, exactly as you were mentioning, engage into global issues like the defense of biodiversity, the defense of the oceans, and to have a sort of to keep China engaged in multilateral discussions. And China has been showing quite some good engagement on biodiversity at the same moment, but at the same time keeping a more tough bilateral the discussion and negotiation for that increasing reciprocity, and to address the issue concerning the Chinese overcapacities, because this is not only a European problem. The Chinese overcapacity is not sustainable for Europe, but also for the rest of the world. So it's also asking China to address more structurally that problem related to its overcapacities, and not only focusing on exporting to the rest of the world to compensate the decreasing growth economy. And it's something
Elvire,
that...
Yeah, at the same time, Xi's visit coincides with two very sensitive events, right? The first of all is Putin's inauguration for a fifth term in office. And then it's also the 25th anniversary of the U.S. bombing of China's embassy in Belgrade. How does France expect China to influence Vladimir Putin? This was one of the more, I guess, nebulous friendships or alliances in the last 2 or 3 years.
I don't think we can expect very seriously to have Xi trying to use its influence on Putin himself. It's rather on the support that China is implementing in providing those so-called dual-use technologies to Russia. And that's where, with the first sanctions that have been implemented targeting some Chinese companies, there is a signal that the Europeans will be much more coordinated with the US on this issue, and not only with the US, but with all the rest, all the members of the G7, and that will be a very key issue that will be discussed in Italy during the next meeting of the G7.
Thank you so much for all of your insight. Elvire Fabry, their Senior Research Fellow at the Jacques Delors Institute. Now, coming up, Labour sweeps the UK local elections, heaping pressure on the Prime Minister Rishi Sunak. So all the details ahead, and this is Bloomberg. Well, let's return to our top story. Israel's military has begun moving civilians out of Rafah in a possible prelude to a long-expected attack on the city in Gaza. Let's get more on this with Rosalind Matheson, Bloomberg's news director in the EMEA region. Ros, thanks for coming back on. I mean, this is something that a lot of allies, European nations, even the U.S., had warned Prime Minister Netanyahu not to do because of civilian casualties.
Well, that's right. But obviously they've been saying for weeks that they're determined to proceed anyway. They have slowed it down. I mean, they've been talking for at least 6 weeks about this offensive, and they've not done it so far. So that is a signal they are actually hearing some of the concerns from around the world. But equally, they've been very, very strong and repetitive about the fact they feel they need to do this to eradicate Hamas once and for all, or to attempt to eradicate Hamas once and for all, and been very, very clear that that's always been their intention. There's a couple of issues around that they need to be careful about, and one is their own hostages inside Gaza at the moment, and where that fits into the potential for a ceasefire, a truce in the fighting that allows potentially the release of some of those hostages. So for Benjamin Netanyahu, it's two competing things: get the hostages out, but also to move against Hamas, with a lot of Palestinian civilians in the middle of the way.
I mean, more than 1 million, or we understand it could be 1 million, and it's unclear where they would go. So you were saying that they're dropping leaflets telling residents to get out.
Well, that's right. And now they're just trying to move them from one part of Rafah, essentially, to another, a little bit north of where they are, from the east of Gaza. And there's other zones in that area they may yet decide that they want to move people out as well. This could just be the first step in getting a lot of people out of the way ahead of an offensive. As you say, there's at least 1 million people that we know of in that area. They've ordered 100,000 of them, or told them to move, to relocate. The question is, how far north can they go? Because, of course, there's been a lot of devastation caused by the war in the northern part of Gaza. What would they be returning to in terms of homes, schools, hospitals, medical care, infrastructure in general? And so not only do you need to get people to move north, you've got to compel them and entice them to move north. And do they really want to do that?
Yeah, so we'll, of course, continue to watch this very closely. Also, we need to talk about the UK, where the opposition Labour Party swept the local and mayoral elections, taking 2 of the country's biggest cities. Now, it showed that Keir Starmer's party firmly is on course for victory at a general election later this year. Well, Bloomberg's Alex Morgan reports.
Sadiq Khan has been duly elected as Mayor of London.
An historic third term in the capital for Labour's Sadiq Khan, adding to a weekend of woe for the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak. The results of England's local election show that the Labour Party is on course to win the next general election, expected to be held later this year. The Conservatives lost over 470 council seats across England. Labour gained over 180. And of the 11 regional mayors up for election, 10 victorious candidates were Labour. The one chink of light for the Prime Minister, the Conservative Mayor of Tees Valley, Ben Houchen, clung on. But down in Brexit-backing Blackpool South, another defeat for the government. The parliamentary by-election there seeing the only Westminster seat up for grabs going to Labour. This was the last major test of public opinion before a general election, which has to be held within 9 months. But so far here in Westminster, the threat of a coordinated move to oust the Prime Minister seems to have receded. Instead, his right-wing party critics signalling they want Sunak to own these losses, and the larger one that's expected to come.
Labour have been maintaining this 20-point lead, and ever since Rishi Sunak, the third Prime Minister of this Parliament, came into office, there's nothing he's done that's been able to move that lead. In fact, if anything, things have got slightly worse.
It wasn't all plain sailing for the Labour Party, though. Signs the opposition is losing support among some communities because of its stance over the conflict in Gaza. Rishi Sunak insists that he is soldiering on. These results, though, suggest the public is hungry for change.
Bloomberg's Alex Morgan reporting there. We're back with Roz Matheson. Roz, so it's a pretty bruising, actually, result for the Tories. What kind of thinking, how are they strategizing this Monday morning?
Well, it sounds like they're coming out on a number of fronts. One is that there's a lot of pressure on Rishi Sunak to tack to the right at this point, to start to use immigration very much in his rhetoric, and to crack down on legal immigration. So we're talking about workers coming in from Europe in particular, and to send that message that he's being hard on that. So he's getting that kind of pressure. But at the same time, there's quite a few votes potentially in the centre that he could be getting from these people who move towards the Lib Dems and other small parties, not to Labour as such. They seem to be in the mix a bit, but instead he seems to be moving to the hard right. So you can expect some announcements on that front in the coming weeks. He also, for the first time, seems to have acknowledged that, they may not win this election, and that it might be, a challenge to form a minority government. And he will probably start warning that, a Labour-led minority government, a bunch of different parties in the mix, would be inherently unstable and fragile. So that'll also be some of the rhetoric you can expect.
Yeah, it is the first time that he kind of mentioned it, although with the 20-point difference in the polls, it seems quite unlikely. I mean, everything can change, right, that the Tories actually win at the election. Does it change the timing of the election?
It doesn't seem so. There was a bit of talk about an election in the next couple of months into the early part of summer, but it feels like Rishi Sunak has decided to wait, perhaps hoping things will just get better. Maybe the economy is in a good spot at the point he calls the election and people are feeling happier about the economic outlook, but he will run out of time at some point. You don't want to be at a point where you have to call the election. It's the worst possible moment for you in terms of the polls and the economy, but the thinking really is towards the latter part of the year.
Ros, thank you so much, as always, for all of your insight. Bloomberg's Rosalind Matheson. Now, coming up, the Bank of England may offer a clearer signal in the coming week on whether it plans to cut interest rates this summer. We'll have a full preview next, and this is Bloomberg. Now, the Bank of England may offer a clearer signal in the coming week on whether it plans to cut interest rates this summer. Let's bring in Ven Ram from Bloomberg's MLive team. Ven, it's exciting. It's BOE, of course, decision on Thursday, and we also have a press conference. What will the governor try to navigate?
Well, morning, Francine. Andrew Bailey has got a lot to get through this week because, on the one hand, the Bank of England wants to cut rates. It is keen to bring down what it sees as a pretty restrictive policy rate, particularly when you consider what the ECB is likely to do. The ECB more or less seems certain to effect the first rate cut in June. So the Bank of England very much wants to cut rates. At least Governor Andrew Bailey is in that camp, seems to be in that camp. But the question is, whether inflation will give them the headroom to do so. Core inflation is running north of 4%. Services inflation is around 6%. And your policy rate is at 5.25. So what kind of a wiggle room the Bank of England has got will emerge later this month when we get the inflation numbers for April, which Mr. Bailey has pointed out will be the key to the evolution of inflation and the BOE's outlook.
So what other central bank decisions are you watching this week?
Well, we've got the RBA meeting tomorrow, Francine, and I don't think they are going to step down on the hawkish rhetoric because late last month we got a nasty inflation surprise from Australia. Core inflation came in at 4%. That was higher than what anyone in the markets was expecting. So the markets there have gone from maybe, we'll get a rate cut later this year to hell no, there's no rate cut possible this year. And in Sweden, it's a completely different contrast because the economy is going down pear-shaped, turning pear-shaped pretty quickly. And the central bank wants to cut rates. It's got the room. Unlike many other central banks, Riksbank has got the policy room to cut rates, and they will probably cut rates this week.
Ven, thank you so much, as always, for joining us. Ven Ram for Bloomberg MLive team. Now, we'll bring you, of course, coverage of the Bank of England rate decision and Andrew Bailey's news conference on Bloomberg TV this Thursday. Of course, that starts at 12 p.m. UK time. Also, don't miss our interview with the UBS chief executive, that's Sergio Armotti, at 7 a.m. UK time tomorrow morning. That's after they release results. There's also a couple of news on, of course, the integration of Credit Suisse. Bloomberg Brief is up ahead, and this is Bloomberg.